Hi, and welcome to McIntyre's Celebrating Families Week 2024. Really excited to be sharing some films with you this week. And if you are waiting for each film to be released, you are now watching film two. And today's focus is around transition. So transitioning from young people's services into the world of adulthood. So my name's Nicola Payne, and I am with the brilliant Debs. Welcome, Debs.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
And yeah, so we're just going to have a conversation about what it can be like. And Debs, one of the reasons you're having this conversation with me is you've lived and breathed this and still are in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my kids are 19 and I have 18-year-old twins. So that whole transition from more about where they've gone from the school. So the twins were in a mainstream setting with a specialist provision, and Kane was in a special school. So the transition was slightly different for both of them into the next stage of their education. But one of the things we was looking at the different options available. And for me, I think one of the biggest challenges was knowing what was available, but also knowing how good it was. And not just on paper, because we've all had, any parent listening will know that there are lots of websites for schools and colleges that look amazing and you think yay, and then you try and get in there and it's just like, no, it's not going to happen. So the transition into the college for us was real. We started off, I asked other parents because that was the best source. The challenge we had was that, especially for Kane, well, for both of them, all of them went to schools that were miles away from our local area. So the parents in like Kane's provision were 40 miles away. So when they were looking at what was available post-19 education, it was all based around that area, which is not what we wanted. We wanted to try and bring him more local. And so we started talking to the families from the college. We talked to the school and asked them what they knew of. And then it was a case of us ringing around loads of places. And some of them, your gut just tells you no. And so I had one of those. I rang up one college and the way they talked about what they offered, and it was just, it really was one of those where it was like, no expectations, basically. No expectations. It's just going to be, yeah, he can come here, but it's just like somewhere for him to be. And it was just like, no, that's not going to work. When we eventually found a few places that we sort of considered, I arranged phone calls with the like head of support. And that I literally, again, I asked the parents, what are the questions I need to ask? Because you don't always know, because it's different in each setting, and going from a school environment into like a college. So what are the questions I need to ask? And that was really useful, and lots of ideas from parents. And all I did was ask on Facebook, on my own profile, because most of us have friends who've got kids in, so like, what are the questions I need to ask? So that was really good. And then from that, we found one that just kept ticking every box for me, and my gut was saying, this is the one. And so one of the big things when we sort of, first of all, once I'd had the talk, I then had to take the kids and say, right, you need to walk around, you need to tell me if this is what you want, because I'm not coming here every day, you will be. And thankfully, they all agreed that Mum was right, which is very rare in itself, but we got there. And then we did transition visits, and we did, I think for Jay, because he's blind, so we had to do some ability training as well. I think we did something like 15 transition visits. One of the things we did is we made sure that it's, so if you're doing transition visits, don't agree to go there every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. You need to go there on a Monday afternoon, a Tuesday lunchtime, a Wednesday morning, a Thursday afternoon. You go at different times throughout, because each college will have different amount of people in, there'll be different things happening. And so we knew that Wednesdays were really busy at the college. So we started off the first transition visits were either Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday, Friday, and then gradually worked up to a Wednesday so we could overhear how loud it would be. But during those times, we also met with the staff who would be supporting him. We answered all their questions. We asked all the questions we had. And it really made such a difference. Those transition visits were huge, even to the point that when they actually started at the college, one of the women we dealt with all the way through, when we got there in the September, they told us she'd left. And we were like, ooh, and we'd had that happen to us before in a school, and it was a nightmare. But because they'd been very good at making us meet all the members of the staff, that actually didn't feel quite so like, ooh. So yeah, I think transition visits are the most important.
And Debs, I mean, I've spoken to you so much over the years, and I never knew you could have so many transition visits. So you say 15. Is that quite usual? Did you feel that you were accommodated, or did you have to push for that? Or was that just part of, obviously it's good practice, but
I think it was different because it was for Jay, because he's blind, he needed so much orientation around the college. So that was extra. With the other two, I think Rosie did about 6 or 7. And one of those was her actually sitting in on the lesson with the tutor who would be doing it, sitting at the back and like listening and whatever. So I think we did about 6 or 7, and I think we probably did a few more. And every time we met with this time was different. We came because every time we met as well as the senior member of staff, we met somebody else somebody who looked after the curriculum, and then we met somebody who looked after the timetable, and then but every time we went, and then what we did with him was I would stay in the canteen and have a coffee. It was lovely. And he would go off with the member of staff, so that relationship started to build. And so, yeah, I think you can ask for them, and you can actually, as part of your education, health and care plan, ask for that as part of the transition process, because you'll get a different education, health and care plan when they transition, and ask for it to be part of that you'll have X amount. But it made the biggest difference. So because by the time they started there in the September, they knew where their classrooms were, they knew where the only thing they didn't know was what days they were going to be in, because the timetable hadn't got to us. But yeah, I think that was one of the really important things, was those transition visits, but also talking to other families, because you can be Ofsted rated amazing and not actually very inclusive.
And you said about calling out to your friends and getting that list of questions, taking that with you is probably a good idea, so you're not having that moment of, oh, I should have asked that. So having that confidence to have that pad or piece of paper or whatever that might be with those questions, and feel that you've got that space to ask them.
Yeah, always having questions. And every time I left, I'd come up with other questions. But because we had all the transition visits, it was actually easier, because it wasn't like, because I knew I had another transition visit like a couple of weeks later. And so we'd go in and go, oh, actually, why are you here? But I built up a really sort of great communication with the college. And even to this day, I know I can drop them an email and just say, but I think it's about also speaking, when you're having the transition visit, speaking to the college about how best to communicate. Is it better if I email you, or unless it's an emergency, obviously ring, and what's the best, and ask them what works best for them, and how do they communicate with parents. So they were the questions that we sort of had on the list as well.
Yeah, and again, it's thinking about the whole picture, isn't it? Your children, yourselves as well, and respecting how the school works, and understanding that there's so much to consider. And me just hearing you today, Debs, it's that gut instinct, isn't it? Having that, following your gut, having that information, going really sort of wise with your questions, And with the transition, you know, I've learned that today. I didn't know that that was even a thing where you could have 50. I mean, I know that was what you had, and that differed for each of your children. But you know, I'm guessing if a bad experience would be you come and visit once and you agree yes or no, and that would be absolutely awful. And you know, so it's just it's being confident as well, isn't it, to stand up to say when things don't feel right, and is important.
I mean, I had a really good idea. By the time we took, even though Kane is older, he'd been in special school up to 19, whereas the twins had left school at 16 and gone into college there. So they'd already done a year at the college when Kane started. So I had a good overview of how the college worked, but he didn't. So he still needed all those transition meetings. And also, going back to what we talked about in yesterday's video, is that person-centered thinking. He's different. And so we needed to focus on how did we make this work for him? Because it might have worked for Jay and it might have worked for Pose, but it didn't necessarily mean it was going to work for him. So yeah, it was using that, what we'd learned from about the person-centered, and taking it into the transition as well.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing to just think through, Debs, is if you are a family member listening to this today and you are fit, you know, yes, you're taking on board all of your sort of your advice there, but I'm still, you know, still feeling so overwhelmed. I've got that knot in my stomach of that, you know, my baby is moving into this bigger world. Any tips around that for a mum or a dad that's listening, or
it's so hard. I'm not even going to pretend it's anything but. And I think what's even harder is when they hit the 18 and suddenly you get some people who go, well, they don't need to speak to you because you're just mum. We've done really well with the college in that they've been very open to, they basically got permission from the kids. They said to them, like, you know, we know that this is how you work, but we need you to just tell us you're happy. Yep, that's fine. And so it's about that letting go a little bit. So for example, when Jay's had some issues after he'd been at the college about a year, and they were all like little minor things, nothing big, nothing that would make me go, oh my god, big mistake. But I also know he needs to start advocating for himself. And so what we were doing was sitting with him and going, right, okay, so you need to let them know that this isn't working. So what we'll do first of all is I'll help you to write an email that you can send through Teams, and then we'll work on it from there. And so what we did was sort of gave him some of the tools he needed to do it. We supported him totally to do it, but actually he loved it, because when the reply came back, they were like, oh right, okay, this is, and he was like, oh, they listened to me. And that was, so we started that with him, about helping himself to be his own self-advocate. It is challenging, because as mum, you just want to fix it and do it, and you know what you're doing, and you're sort of like, oh, I could do this in 2 minutes. But actually it's about sitting down and letting them do it for themselves where they can, and just fully supporting them until, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Debs. And if you're, you know, again, if you're watching this film, we've had a discussion for a very short amount of time today. So if you've got any questions, do get in touch with me or your, you know, your friends and family as well. But my email is nicola.payne@mcintyrecharity.org. And any questions that you have for Debs as well, because Debs is the person that has lived and breathed this, you know, so we hope you found this useful today. And thank you, Debs. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you to my kids, because without them, I wouldn't have any of this knowledge or experience.